Okay, let's get started. So this session is making informed decisions. This is all about dashboards, and this is not, to start with, this is not a technical session. So this is under the communicate and lead tract. So we're going to talk about what does a process look like for building a dashboard. What does that start from the time an executive says, I want a dashboard, until you hand it off to the people who are doing the technical build? What does that entire sort of process look like? So my name is Rick Grantham. I'm a certified business intelligence professional from TDWI with a specialty in leadership of business intelligence teams. Also a Six Sigma black belt, and my day job is I run a business intelligence practice for a consulting firm. During the nighttime, I freelance as kind of an Excel enthusiast on Excel TV. Please silence your cell phones. So this is not a technical session. This will be process-related, walking you through how do you go about creating the dashboard, what are the steps of building requirements. What you're going to learn are the best approaches for tackling dashboards. So this is in my 15 to 20 years experience of having to build dashboards. What's worked? Where have I gotten in trouble? Where have I messed up and been embarrassed? And how can you learn from some of that? We're going to talk about the best way to scope the data for your dashboard. How do you determine what's going to be on your dashboard and what isn't? We'll talk about how and when to get management feedback. There's a right time to do it and there's a wrong time to do it, and we'll talk about that. And how do you document query mockups? So from the point of doing your initial mockups, at what point do you document the queries that you hand off to the database people? Whether this be your SQL Server people or any sort of database, what do you hand off to them and what should that look like? So these are the things we're going to go through. These are, in my mind, the 7 or so steps that I go through. So we'll talk about how do you determine what the data scope is from measures and dimensions. Well, first off, in the room here, am I talking to, how many people are consultants in the room? A couple, handful, okay. So the rest of you aren't, so I'm going to tell all of you guys what the consultants are doing to you. We'll chat about that a little bit. And how many people are in the private sector versus the public sector? So public sector, by that I mean you work in a government of some type. Okay, about a handful. Okay, gotcha. And how many of you are database technicians versus kind of business analysts? So database technicians, okay. And data analysts, kind of out there with the business. Okay, so this session will be more for you, but I'll give you an idea of the sort of things you need to hand off to a technician. So we're going to go through determining data scope. What does that look like? There's no point in spinning your wheels, creating a lot of mockups on things you don't even have data for. So we're going to talk about how you do that at the very beginning. We'll talk about whiteboarding and what are some best steps around whiteboarding your solutions. Query mockup, prototyping. What are some secrets around prototyping and what's the best way to do that in Excel? I'll also give you a few links here on where to go get more resources for that. And then we'll talk about getting the feedbacks after you've done your mockups. So first off, determining data scope. This happens. This is going to happen after this conference, right? They've seen Miko Yuck speak, and they've seen all the pretty visualizations from the keynotes, and your executive just came back from this conference. And they are really excited because they saw all these cool tools. They saw, all the dashboards and all the flashy stuff. And they know that you have some reporting tools. They know you have some capacity to do some stuff, so they call you into their office. And they say, hey, let's build some dashboards. So the question to you is, what do you do? So this is a show and tell. So what do you do? Anybody? Hands up. What do you do whenever the executive comes to you? I guess I already told that, huh? Okay, we'll get to that. What are some other things that get done? Yes? Okay, expectation setting, got it. Anything else? Yes. Okay. Anything else? So it's a little tool for that. For any of you guys get into process improvement or process engineering called a 5 why test. So this is just where it seems so silly that this is an actual thing, right? But especially if you're going from a metric to trying to find out what the root cause driver is, just asking why 5 times, right? It's that simple. And that's actually a Six Sigma thing. Do you believe that? I mean, people get paid a lot of money just to know you asked 5 times to get 5. So we missed our head count number. Well, why did we miss our head count number? Oh, well, because we closed a plant in Wichita. Well, why did we close a plant in Wichita? Once you get about 5 layers deep, usually you start getting to some actual root cause drivers. So anyways, what are some other things? Yes? Okay, what's being done already? Okay, gotcha. Yes?
How they want it heard.
Okay. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So let's move on then. In my experience, I've walked in a lot of times to executives' offices and said, "So tell me, what do you want? What do you want on your dashboard?" That's the obvious question that come back from that. And here's the problem with that: you come across as somebody who doesn't really know their stuff, right? You come across as somebody who's being reactive. You're not coming in with a plan of. You're not coming in with an annual report and saying, based on the annual report, here are the 3 or 4 things in my mind you should look at. And based on those 3 or 4 things I think that you should be looking at, the 3 or 4 metrics, here are the 4 or 5 ways that you would typically slice and dice that through different dimensions, and here's some sample reports of what those could look like. Now, tell me where I'm wrong. Just start crossing things off. So there's a proactive way to do this. We'll walk you through that. Okay. Oh, whiteboard. Step number 1, please, sorry about that. I guess I cut you guys off, didn't I? Please resist the urge to start drawing. All right? You'll probably hear this from Miko tomorrow as well. Resist the urge to get, this is something consultants do. So the consultants that raised your hand, a marker is like crack to a consultant. Right? They cannot wait to get this thing in their hand and come up and start drawing pictures for you, right? Resist the urge to do that first. And here's the reason. You'll end up drawing a lot of things out with your dashes and your dials, and here's how things, and the executive can't wait to get that marker either, right? And they're going to draw a whole lot of things up, and it's not until 3 weeks later you're going to come back and say, yeah, we really don't have data to support, the 3 or 4 things that we just went through, so hey, let's come back and do it again. And it makes it seem like you don't have your stuff together. So resist the urge to do that. It'll save you a lot of time later. First off, a lot of these were over here. Look at what do they want to track. And does everybody here know what a dimension and measure are? The audience? Okay. If not, then I'm going to just talk about it just a little bit so that we're all on the same page. This is more kind of data warehousing, kind of business intelligence stuff. So if you're an Excel person, you're not supposed to necessarily know this. A measure is anything you would do math against. So if you're an Excel person, think of a pivot table. The guts of the pivot table, the middle part, where all the math happens and your summing and your counting, et cetera. Those are all measures. Those are metrics. Dimensions, those are the things you would slice and dice those things by, those measures by. So I want to see headcount attrition by location, and that by location is your dimension. So understand the things they're likely to want to slice and dice by. What are the measures? And people like Miko, she's not in here, is she? Good. Okay. She would say that you can't even go to the next step here. She'll turn away your work, right? She'll likely turn away your work if you haven't already done these measures here. She can afford to turn away work. I can't, right? So go ahead and make sure that you get as many of these calculations as you can, because they'll say, well, I want the distance between the home zip code and the work zip code, because that might be a driver of reason people are leaving. well, try to get as many of those measures and actually get them to calculate that as you can. Only then can you try to figure out where the source system is of these things. Let's give you an idea what that looks like. So for every single one of these steps, I'm going to attempt to walk you through a demo. Walk you through, I mean, this is real life stuff. So what is the Excel spreadsheet I would use to do that? Right, so we'll walk through that. So once I'll show you the spreadsheet, once it comes up, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between a strategic dashboard and an operational dashboard. What is a bottoms-up approach versus a tops-down approach, and when is it appropriate to bring an annual report into your executive's office, and when is it not? Okay. So you can see from the tabs here, we're going to go through almost every single step and some different exercises that I go through for each of those. So first off, I'm going to show you kind of a strategic dashboard and how I'd figure out data scope for that. You'll see, we talked about KPIs. What sort of KPIs would there be on the business side? So we'll just say that you're you're trying to build a dashboard for recruiting, right? Everybody brings in new employees into their business or whatever. Let's say you're building a dashboard for that. Look past, if you can, the things that are what I would consider efficiency metrics. They are the easiest things to get. How fast did you move an application from one place to the next? And look into things that are necessarily going to have an impact on the business. And by that I mean, okay, so you hired someone new. 3 months later, 6 months later, what sort of a performer was that? And so encourage your business to look at not only kind of business KPIs, but operations KPIs. And this is a simple kind of a bus model, I would call it, that I use to figure this stuff out. On the left-hand side would be I would ask the executive, what are the fields he's wanting, whether that is a measure or a dimension. We'd ask them what sort of system that is coming from. X's, what is the technical name if that's available, whether that be in your source system, whether that's SAP or Microsoft or any of the other source systems. What is the technical name? The executive's not going to have that, but I would get this before I move forward. And then X is here, so you can kind of determine where is the largest intersection between all the different reports that you need to build. But let's take a look at what that means once you look at operational. Wow, this is uglier, isn't it? So once you're doing this in operational, once you've figured out kind of the KPIs at the highest level, at least what the executive is looking at, you can start to determine what sort of reports you're likely to have. So let's take attrition, just as an example. The executive says we have way too many people who are leaving the business, leaving the company. So we know that attrition or turnover, headcount turnover, is something that they're interested in, so that's a measure. And once we know the 4 or 5 dimensions or things they're going to want to slice and dice by, whether that's by location, is generally one by time, different months and years. There's usually 4 or 5 things they're going to want to slice and dice those by. You can start to determine report 1, report 2, report 3, report 4. Let's take that same measure then, and we'll slice that by dimension 1, by dimension 2, and start to walk in with a model here that says, okay, from a data scope perspective, for every single item that we have here, here's the system it's in, here's the technical name, and here's some sample reports that we could have from that. As you scroll a little bit further to the right, you'll see as you're starting to talk to the source system, everybody know what a source system is? Okay. For the rest of you, source system is just, you're not getting, source system might be your SAP system or whatever the source system is for that type of information. Where is it coming from? Is it coming from SAP, Dynamics, et cetera? Where's all this information coming from? So usually you'd have some sort of additional logic or any sort of dependencies, and make sure all this is documented as well. Now, I'll have all these spreadsheets available probably on Excel TV website here shortly, so I'll have all this available for download shortly. Now notice all of this was done before we ever did a single mock-up. I'm afraid to put this in presentation mode again. Here we go. Here's a lower tech option. Don't go through this and force your executive to go through it if they don't say, hey, some guy at a conference told me to take up 5 hours of your time. Don't put this on me. This isn't my fault, all right? You manage your executives. That's on you. There are some lower tech options that I've seen. based on your executive's willingness to go through that sort of a process. They'll come to the meeting prepared. Any sort of, usually I would bring any sort of data elements that I believe are available in existing reports. I would bring those with me to the meeting. Any sort of metrics, and I would bring this on the whiteboard. So for the purpose of a whiteboard, if I'm there with the executive and they say, well, I don't know really what I want, I would bring the metrics that are already available, and those would be Post-it notes. Start putting Post-it notes up here. What are the different things that you want available from the measures? Same thing with the dimensions. And start to post that right next to the whiteboard. Because at the end of this, you're going to want to take a picture, right? You're going to get a month down the road whenever you're starting to build a dashboard, and their opinion is going to be different from what they remembered, right? And so as you're doing this is going to end up creating your mock-up for your dashboard. Let's talk about whiteboarding then. Things to consider before you do any sort of whiteboarding. We're going to talk about a strategic dashboard, what that is. I consider that to be revolution. And most of us in here are data analysts. We want the revolution. We might walk in with the annual report and say, yes, here's what your metrics should be, and let's go ahead and really, in my opinion, about 15% or so of executives are really ready for that. They want the data, they want it at their fingertips, but they really don't necessarily get it. They see this being more of an operational dashboard, which I'll call evolution instead of revolution. Well, you'll start with a few reports, and then those reports, somebody eventually says, well, can you make a dashboard out of this? And the reports are kind of coming from the bottom up, and then after a while they say, well, can you do some prediction? It's kind of a bottoms-up approach versus a tops-down approach. So what does that look like? This is a model that I use whenever I find somebody who's ready for revolution, right? And in this case, I would start out with an annual report. I would print off that annual report, and I'll go through this in a lot more detail in a session I'm doing tomorrow afternoon. Be more around how do you optimize a business intelligence deployment. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. But for now, we'll just say you start with an annual report. And based on that annual report, if I go to Microsoft's annual report, there are a few things there around headcount. We'll just use that as an example. And within there, I can start to determine what are my overall kind of metrics at the highest level. That would flow down then to a few supporting dashboards. And I'll show you some examples of this in a moment. And then I would argue that you only create reports, diagnostic reports in this sort of a model, that exists solely to answer why a KPI was missed. Right? This is a tops-down approach. Now, some people might say, okay, well, the drag-and-drop environment. Really, it didn't make it to the slide for some reason, but usually your drag-and-drop environment would be over here. And they would ask, okay, well, what goes in my drag-and-drop environment? If I'm going to take this sort of approach, I have an idea of what my reports are going to be. What should be in my drag-and-drop? And that's really an output then. All these arrows go here. I know exactly what's going to be in my drag-and-drop environment because it's an output of the diagnostic reports, the KPIs that were here, and the KPIs were here. So really, in a tops-down approach, once you know that top bit and you start to flow this out, you have a clear idea of what's in your drag-and-drop environment, what are potential diagnostic reports, and supporting dashboards. So in that model, though, most executives will say, yeah, but then they really don't want to go that way. Right? They see reporting and analytics not necessarily as an asset, right? They see it as trying to reduce expenses. Here's what I mean. They want to create reports because right now somebody's doing it manually. And so can you automate this? So they see it as an expense savings, not necessarily as an asset. So in almost every boss I've had, and I do this for a living, right? And I walk in, I'll pull up all these models, they say, yeah, we're kind of in the second bucket here. These are my bosses, for analytic teams. And so they're kind of, what they want to do is take then a bottoms-up approach, which is they'll roll out for any sort of operational system, they'll turn on what I'll call standard reports. So any of your source systems, usually there's some sort of a reporting element to it that comes with the system, right? You turn those reports on, and they'll turn on the existing reports, and they'll see who yells. And whoever yells, they'll start building some reports. And then from there, they'll start to build some dashboards. It'll start to flow upwards. Anyone have experience like this? Is your company like this? Okay, got it. Okay, so in this case, it kind of evolves. So here's the thing. I've made this mistake. I made this mistake with Boston Scientific, where I walked in with an annual report. I made this mistake, right? I walked in with an annual report and flowed everything out from the tops down, and the meeting ended about 10 minutes into the meeting because they were like, time out. You're doing, this isn't what we want. We're about, they're looking for a bottoms-up approach, which is fine. So I'm telling you, get this right and understand your audience to begin with. It'll save you some embarrassment later. So, some best practices. Simplicity is key. I'm sure you've heard that. And I really want to hit on these three areas: the navigation, segmentation, and criteria selection. Those three, if you get those right, you'll see them in every successful dashboard. If you get those three right, it's a very good thing for you. And I'll show you, hopefully we can find some examples online here. We're about to go online. And I'll show you some examples of, if somebody misses one of them, it's usually segmentation. Right? They'll get the navigation, the tabs across the top. They'll get an idea that there needs to be criteria selection for some drop-downs, but they'll completely miss that the dashboard needs to be segmented in a way that makes sense. Don't use pie charts if you want to. I mean, it's not necessarily best practice. Here's some of the drawbacks to it. It shows one data point, but every executive wants a gauge. They just do. It's pretty, especially in the whiteboarding session. Oh, they start drawing the gauges from the car, but I mean, think about it. You're getting one piece of data. You're not getting like a line chart or something that gives you more robust information. Let's show you some examples of that. Is the guy who helps me make my computer work here? Guess not. Okay. So here's what you would have seen. Basically, all I was going to do is go to Google and type in company dashboard. And once you go to company dashboard, go over to images. And what you'll see is in every single dashboard, there's navigation. Every single one that looks good. They may have the navigation at the top, they may have it on the left-hand side, but every single one of them has some sort of navigation to it. Every single one of them has some sort of criteria selection. And this would be your line of business, where there might be radio buttons, and you select the line of business that you want, or you select the year and the period, etc. Most of them have some sort of a criteria selection. Where, like I said, where most of these are missed is in segmentation, and since I can't show it to you, I'll draw it. Here's where they will miss, where they'll mess up. They'll have their navigation across the top. They'll have some criteria selection over here. And then they'll have another piece of criteria selection here, another one here. But you can't tell that this criteria selection only goes for this graph. There's nothing that's segmenting things off that lets you know that certain criteria only goes to certain graphs or certain bits of data. And so look for this. If your dashboard is hard to read for your end user, this is usually the thing that's missed that's needed. It's bad that I had examples for every single step, which means I have to go past PowerPoint every single time. Let's give the man a round of applause here. Welcome back. So let's get into query mockup. So now that you've done the whiteboarding session and you have an idea of what needs to go where, you've done your data scoping, how do you go about creating something that you can start to hand off to your data team? So I usually do a query mockup in a spreadsheet. And this is just an idea of if I was going to get a pivot table of data, here's what I would love for it to look like, if nothing else. But usually there would be a list of different elements that you would need: your field names, your formats, numbers, currencies, etc. And a sample of that. And it's as simple as this. Now, if you're using a desktop dashboarding tool, a lot of times, a lot of these tools could sit right on spreadsheets. And I'm thinking of probably what Miko is most famous for, which is Excelsius. Any of those sorts of dashboarding tools, a lot of them will sit on top of Excel right now. So creating a model like this serves really two purposes, right? It serves the purpose of not only having something that gives you an idea of the sort of departments you're going to need, how you would love to have the data structured if you could have it any way you wanted to. But it also starts to give you a source of information to do further mockups. Because now that you start to have at least some dummy data here, you can start to do mockups within the tool set. PowerPoint. So some of the benefits, it does create, well, I guess I already said this, it does create an initial data set for the designer that you can start to use in further mockups, because realize all you've done so far is something on a whiteboard. You haven't even put it into Excel yet. You haven't even put it in any sort of dashboarding tool. It's just a picture on a board, right? But in creating that sort of data set, at least you have something where you can start to do mockups, start to put something in a tool set, and also it gives the database technician a starting place. So went through that. Let's do some Excel prototyping. So now you're going to transform the whiteboard into an Excel visual. So we've got a few tricks with that. First off, prototyping combines several steps from the previous sessions. The whiteboardings, I use this to drive the Excel design. So anything that I took a picture of, like over here, and I took a picture of that, I use that to drive my design, because you're going to bring this back to an executive in the next step and say, how is this close to what you want? And you're going to give them something to play with. You know, and so you're going to want to have that picture with you. And also, you've already done the query mockups, provide an initial data set for the dashboards. So here are some links. I'll provide these links again on the Excel TV website. Color theory. Colorbrewer2.org is a good place to go. I'm afraid to launch Excel or launch Explorer right now. But Color Brewer 2 is a good place. And what this allows you to do is play with templates, color templates. You say, I want a blue, or I want something that goes with my company design, or my company's kind of color scheme. And it will give you the hex codes and everything else. You can just put those right into Excel if you want to. Good place to start here. If you're a YouTube person, go to a channel called The Excel Kid. If you're familiar with him, I believe he's out of the UK. Great YouTube channel for Excel dashboards. So some of the tricks, or some of the things I'm going to show you here in a little bit, you know, some links here around introduction. So how do you go about building some of the graphics? How do you go about using random number generators so it looks like there's data in the background, so your executive can kind of play with drop-downs? And so I'd recommend you take a look at this as well. So I'll show you some examples then. Okay? So here's an example of a mock-up in Excel. So a few things about this. Everything that I'm showing you here, you can go to those YouTube videos and learn exactly what I did here. It's a lot of objects. It's a lot of, we'll even go down and show you some of the graphs. As you come down, some of the graphs and the chart types. Now here's the thing. This isn't actually connected to any data, right? It's not connected to any back end or anything. But here we can allow the executive to come over and press on job, select a job 1, job 2, job 3, and the graphs update. So you have to tell them this is all kind of junk data, doesn't mean anything, but the graphs can all update here. So the way this is done, the way you can kind of get something like this, so at least your executive have something to play with and see if this is what they want or not, is I'm doing this all through random number generation. Pardon me. So you see over here the formulas on the right-hand side. These are a group of lists. And anytime that you'll see the numbers will update automatically. This is random, ran between. And as we select here, press the enter, all the numbers are updating. That's driving the graph. So it looks like things are changing. They're not really. It's just random number generation to get them something to play with. As you go over to the recruiting dashboard, how this is done is behind this drop-down menu. Right-click it here. We'll move this out of the way if we can. Go to the top. You'll see that number 5. So all I'm doing then is I'm telling this box to, based on when you select something, put the output behind this object, right, where the executive can't see it, doesn't know it's there or anything else. You can select any sort of job. It changes that number to 3, just in order that it was in the list. As a result, that then makes the random number generation go. It makes the graphs look like they're changing. So anything that I'm showing you here, you can go over to the Excel kit, and they'll show you kind of how to do all this stuff and how to set up a lot of the visuals. Because as you scroll down, this wouldn't look like a normal type of visual for a graph, just as an example, right? So how do you get that with the rounded edges, et cetera? So you can go through those videos. I'll show you how to do all of that. The thing is, now you're giving the executives something to give you more feedback on. It's more than just a picture on a wall. So now that you've done this, you're able to elicit feedback, right? Schedule a meeting to review the prototype. And the prototype different from a mock-up. Mock-up was the thing you did on the whiteboard. Prototype is actually something they could play with, the interactive thing that you're giving them. And this whole time, the database technician is working in the background, making sure your data is starting to get set up. So you've started that process while you're building your prototype. So I would take a picture of that. I'd bring it in with me and say, here's what we've developed that you can play with that actually looks a lot like what we've created, what we drew up in the mock-ups. Prototype looks like the mock-up. And grab the feedback and make any alterations to the prototype as necessary. So building the mock-ups and feedback. So getting to this next step, actually, this is the first step that actually requires any sort of development effort at all. Everything else so far has just kind of been Excel. But now that you've gotten the feedback, you have the ability to get into your actual dashboard development tool and to start building these things. Actually, I just showed you the mock-up example. Okay. So you go to this conference. Your executive goes to this conference and says, hey, I just saw these cool metrics and tools and everything that's out there. Can you help me build a dashboard? So you come back to, what do you do then? Well, really, the steps are, here's what I would do. Determine your data scope before you ever do any sort of whiteboard sessions. From there, query mock-up, any sort of Excel prototypes. There's a feedback session here. Don't be in your executive's office every 2 days to 3 weeks. Get the initial whiteboard session, take pictures of it, and once you have a prototype ready that you can kind of bring to them in Excel, pretty simple to do. Just a few YouTube videos, you can probably figure it out. Get a feedback session here, but at this time you're sending them what looks like an application. Something that they can actually interact with while your database technician is building something for you. Once they give the okay, you do the dashboard mock-up. This is the dashboard mock-up and whatever your reporting tool is. If your reporting tool allows you to export in Flash, I would highly recommend that because you can send a Flash document, usually a SWIFT file, to the executive and they can play with it. It's kind of self-contained. So if you're able to do that, that's a good thing. And then final developments. I would really only go back to feedback sessions in 2 different places. So where can you find more information? KPI Mega Library is a good place to start. So if you have an idea of what's in your annual report or what the executive, they're coming to you saying, well, what sort of things should we measure? This is a great resource to get started on. It might cost you a little bit, but it's a good place to get started on. They'll break this down by what industry you're in, what department you're in. Are you in the public sector, private sector? So I usually start here. Color Brewer's good. Once you start getting into analysis of different colors, you start getting into the design phase. And we talked about the playlist here. So 5 things to take home with you. Don't design anything until you've completed the data scoping exercise, please. You'll waste 2 or 3 weeks, and they'll wonder why you wasted 3 weeks with them. That should include a data element matrix, which I'll make available. The data element matrix is the thing that had all the checks and the X's. So you know exactly if a data piece isn't available, all the reports that'll impact. If you're designing a strategic dashboard, make sure you review the company's annual report first. Walk in with that if you know that that's the case, if you know that you have that sort of executive. It makes you look like you're actually trying to make a connection between the executive and the strategic direction that the company's going in. And it doesn't, these things are free for the most part. Just go out to Yahoo and just look for them. If you're designing an operational dashboard, which is usually 80% of them, review all the existing reports because you're doing a bottoms-up approach. If there's any existing reports that are out there, you start with that analysis for bottoms-up and figure out where the overlap is between different reports so you have an idea of what the important metrics are that are being used today. And then finally, there's a color wheel, which you talked about color brewer for different color palettes. Any questions? Yes. 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 So the question is there a difference when you're doing it for yourself, for your own company, versus you're doing it for a client? Usually you'll have more insight if you already work for the company on whether they're strategic. So really, if you're coming in as a consultant or you're doing this for a client, you usually have to ask a lot more questions up front about just getting that first step right on whether this is strategic or operational dashboard. But for me, I do the same steps, whether it's internal to my company or whether I'm doing it for a client. Any other questions? Yes. Any particular tools for building the dashboard? I'm kind of tool agnostic on that. So I tend to use Excelsius for any sort of mock-ups because that generates a Swift file. So I tend to use that quite a bit, which is that's a business objects tool. But it sits on top of Excel and allows you to build a lot of dashboards and things like that. Relatively inexpensive. Anything else? Yes.
You mentioned the example session.
Within the next 48 hours, you go over to excel.tv, I'll do a blog post, and I'll write all of that up and make that all available. Beyond that, I'll also make sure that the past business analytics people here have access to that link as well. Well, thank you very much for your time, everyone.